Good afternoon. Good evening. Good evening. That's the word I'm looking for, everybody. My name is Chris Weave. This is Starfleet Tactical. It is Saturday at 10 o'clock, which is always a good time to say that I don't speak for my employer, any of my employers, past, present, or future. Alec Peters said that he was going to join me today, but I have not yet seen him. And so hopefully, in fact, let me send a message real quick on the cell phone. I didn't do that. I sent him a let me see real quick. Sorry about this. I should have done this before I went live. Showtime. Okay. So just send him a text message on the phone. In any event, this is going to be kind of an eclectic show. I've got a bunch of stuff to talk about, but it's kind of all over the place. It's not anything that's any one given topic. It's sort of clean up on a bunch of different stuff. One thing I did want to say, though, is I went and I rewatched the Battle Line versus Battle Group one. And you may remember that there was somebody who at the time said, "I'm not following this. You lost me." And, yeah, I understand why I lost you. Part of it was that there was a bunch of stuff in my head. I had a bunch of stuff going on in my head that I wasn't necessarily doing a great job of getting it out of my head and into the conversation. So I'm going to reapproach that at some point and redo that particular thing. And so you guys will get a second opportunity to sort of grok it. So, let's see. There was a couple of things I was going to talk about. One is, if you look right there, you will see that I've acquired a Festivus pole. I had a Festivus pole at my last job when I lived in Charlottesville, and I had it at the office, and I left it at the office when I went, because that office really, really seriously got into decorations and stuff like that for Christmas. And so I bequeathed my Festivus pole to the office so that they would be able to keep it. But I decided I wanted a Festivus pole. Now, if you've watched the Seinfeld episode, you will know that an Orthodox Festivus pole is a sturdy aluminum pole. My pole is stainless steel, and that's because I'm Reformed. So the other thing is, if you look over right there, I got to point this out to Alec when he comes on. That's a new Space Marine figure that I just got, that I've decided is going to live in the background there. I may take it into work at some point, but I may just leave it sitting there. So that's going to be there from now on, sort of looking over my shoulder, at least for the short term. It was surprisingly cheap. I got it for like $15. All the other ones in the line were like 40, and this one was 15. So I went ahead and got that one. Let's see. Next thing I was going to talk about is, you may recall that Alec and I talked about some Jerry Anderson tech manual stuff that came out. And so I wanted to go through them. I went and pulled them off my shelf. And so the first one is the Shadow Technical Operations Manual. So first things first, he talked about Benedict Cumberbatch's mother being in the show. There she is. That's Virginia Lake, Colonel Virginia Lake. So you can sort of see he kind of looks like her. There's a lot of nifty stuff in this book. I heartily recommend it, including, for instance, like, you ever wonder what the inside of the UFO looks like? That's what the inside of the UFO looks like. I wish they'd done a little bit more there, because they don't really give a good idea of exactly where they live inside the UFO. But there's a lot of other nifty stuff. Like there's an entire section on the development of SID, the Space Intruder Detector. And I want to say they show an alternate scheme. So they claim that the original plan was, if you look real carefully under the nose there, you can see there's a moon-based style interceptor there. So the claim was that originally when they built it, it was going to be manned and it was going to have an interceptor on it. And then they later decided to go with full automation, but it still has, if you look over in the other page, you can see that it's got a control seat there. And I think that that's the tunnel that goes to the docking port up front. So it can actually, if they need to, they can put a crew on board and it can be manually operated for attitude control and stuff. The artwork in here is just fantastic. Like if you've ever wondered what the inside of the hangar bay looks like, there's the inside of the hangar bay. And it's just really pretty well done all the way through. It's as well done as it could be, considering there's a lot of things about this show that just don't make sense in some very, very important ways. Like for instance, the entire idea about them hiding underneath a movie studio. It's like, okay, I know that you got to have a cover, but the easiest way to have a cover is to be out in the middle of nowhere. It's actually hard to have a cover when you're in town like that. And, theoretically, Straker is running a movie studio. That's a full-time job and then some. And so you would think that if all the people there are like cross-listed as being producers and stuff like that, how do they have time to actually maintain your cover? It takes a lot of work to maintain a cover. I've never had to do it, but I know people who have. It takes a lot of work to do that, and so this is a little bit problematic. But that having been said, I absolutely love it. Although, okay, so the mobiles are kind of interesting, but if you're part of a secret organization, do you put the name of the secret organization on the side of your vehicle? Does that make any sense to any of you guys? Doesn't quite make any sense to me. All right, so the next one is the Moonbase Alpha Technical Manual, which comes in this weird orange color. I don't know why they would make it this weird orange color. But let's see. Let me go through here. So look at that eagle-like thing there. So what's up with that? That doesn't look the same. The pieces look a little different. The nose looks different. The side sponsons look different. What's going on with that? Well, the answer is that's actually based upon some concept art from the original version of Space 1999. Originally, Space 1999 was going to be a sequel to UFO. The idea was they were going to jump it forward. UFO took place in like 1980. It was a 1969 show taking place in 1980. And they were going to jump it forward a bunch. And, 1999. And Straker was going to be the commanding shadow from the moon. And it was going to be, season 2 of UFO. And they were running it around the U.S., because it was a syndicated show. So they're going to all the conferences and stuff and talking to local station owners, and they all went, "Yeah, you already did that once. We're not really interested in that." And it's like, "Oh, really? Okay, why not?" And the answer was, "Well, they don't go anywhere." And somebody in frustration said, "What do you want us to do? Blow the moon out of orbit?" And they go, "Yeah, we'd buy that." And so they ended up retooling the show with the idea of blowing the moon out of orbit. Now, I made the comment the other day that I have 3/4 of a master's degree from the University of Maryland. During that time, when I took a class that basically was defense physics. It wasn't just physics, but it was like, we did things like the rocket equation, and we did things like I could calculate. I learned how to calculate what the range of an airplane would be based upon the efficiency of the engines and stuff like that. And there was a follow-on class where I learned, like, if you have to take down a missile field and it's got an ABM system, how many missiles do you allocate? How many warheads do you allocate to taking out the radar? And how do you get to the radar? And it was a bunch of stuff like that. And as part of that, as an extra credit question one week, we had the question: if you took all the nuclear arsenals of the world, and he gave us a sum for that, and detonated them on the backside of the moon, what happens? The answer is the flash lasts for 30 seconds. and the moon moves such a minuscule amount that it's lost in the significant figures. You could detonate every nuclear weapon we've ever produced, and the moon doesn't move. Makes a big explosion, big pretty explosion, but it doesn't actually move. So much for that idea. That having been said, Moonbase Alpha is pretty cool. Got lots of drawings like this, for instance. That's of the reactor room, I believe. And I believe, if I remember correctly, nuclear generating area 3 was destroyed when technician Anton Zorev was taken over by an unknown entity, which forced him to walk into the reactor. So I don't know if you all remember that, but the guy who played Anton Zorev in that episode, I'm drawing a blank on his name, that character was played by Ian McShane, who, of course, later made a name for himself in Tombstone and was in John Wick, and then later had his own. At one point, was played in his own TV show called Kings that was based upon Solomon and not Solomon, Saul and David from the Book of Kings in the Bible. It was actually a very interesting TV show, and it's sort of funny that the marketing guys totally backed away from the entire biblical thing. They didn't even mention it, whereas that was what everybody was really intrigued by that, and then they don't mention the thing that's intrigued by. That's how TV works. The marketing people sometimes just seem to be on another planet. I think the right stuff really was limited by the fact that the marketing people chose poorly in terms of which marketing campaign they went with. They went with a very serious marketing campaign and it didn't sell. The movie Last Action Hero went with a marketing campaign that didn't tell you what type of movie you were signing up to see. And I think that that's a problem because people, I know I went in thinking that I was going to see something like Commando, or, something that at least had some pretenses of having some serious aspects to it. And instead I got a farce that had a cartoon character as a minor character. And so, okay, that it's a great movie, but it took the second watching for me to figure out that it was a great movie. Let's see what else is in here. I'm trying to think of it. If there's one that sort of jumps out at me as I go through here. There's not one that really sort of jumps out other than here's a look inside the hangar, which is kind of nifty. There's another book. Alec had mentioned Martin Bauer, and his skydiver model was done by Martin Bauer, who was the model maker for this. I think he is the one who did a book called The Future is Fab. And it was all the concept illustrations for these books, for these shows. It was all the drawings and stuff like that. And there's one of the ones that's in there shows up as some computer generated art in the Shadow manual. Let me go find it real quick. It's the original design for the Interceptor. And I'm almost there. Hold on a second. Interceptor. There we go. The original design for the Interceptor looked like this. And so it was going to be a two-place thing. They decided that you can see that it's got windows, sort of side-by-side capsule arrangement. They decided that was kind of boring. And so they changed it to the funky aircraft cockpit thing that we saw on the TV show. But that's sort of listed as being the prototype. There's some fan-produced blueprints that actually go all the way from that. I think it starts with that prototype through the interceptor, and then all the different things that get you to the Mark 9 Hawk. And it's a set of Mark 9 Hawk blueprints. And you may remember the Mark 9 Hawk from Space 1999. And it starts with the conceit that Space 1999 is set in the same universe, that the aliens eventually gave up, that they built the moon base with the original intent that it was going to be this defensive fortress, and they ended up not using it that way because the aliens stopped attacking. So as long as I'm doing notebooks, I figured this is my latest acquisition, which I haven't had a time to go through yet, and it's Ian M. Banks' The Culture drawings. Now, these are not professionally produced artwork. This is all of his notebooks that he did for things in the culture. And so they're all his drawings of stuff. Some of them are quite simple. So you'll see that he's got the stats there for the ship, but it's just a very simple outline. This one, the Equator class General Services Vehicle, is listed as 6,400 by 3,200 by 1,600 meters, 4 intermediate bays, 76 main base, 150 medium, and then a complement of 4,320,000 approximately, stuff like that. And so some of it's more detailed than that, but I find Ian Banks' stuff to be very interesting. But I like the idea of his books probably better than I actually like his novels. I've read a couple of them, and I like the back of the novel. I like the novels themselves less. But I've come to the conclusion that I always walk away from one of his novels unsatisfied, and I have to read them all, because they've all got some great ideas in there, even if I'm going to be unsatisfied with the story that he actually tells us. Bob says it would be a blast to use Satellite Toolkit to play with the ridiculous Space 1999 concepts used in the show. I think it would also be fun to do some of them in Kerbal Space Simulator, but I don't think you could actually make it work in Kerbal. Let's see, there was another... One Horse asked the question, does my employer have opinions and policies on Starfleet tactics and doctrine? No, they don't. But that is the reason why I don't talk about current stuff. Like at one point, Alex invited me to be on Axanar after Axanar Confidential or whatever, something over on his stuff. And he said, can you come on and talk about Ukraine? And I said, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I stay away from sort of real world stuff. Like I don't talk about Space Force type stuff as a general rule. If I do mention Space Force type stuff, I keep it to pretty much anything that doesn't have any particular special knowledge for that. And that's because I don't want to cross the streams. If I cross the streams, then I get to the point where I have to start talking to my public affairs people and they get a say. Whereas right now, I'm at the point where if they come and they say, hey, you're doing a show on YouTube, why didn't you tell us about it? I'm going to say, I talk about Star Trek. I talk about phasers and photon torpedoes. I didn't know you cared. And so I want to keep it on topics that they don't care about. And that generally works. So, I don't talk about those things at science fiction conventions either for the exact same reason. Okay, so that was it for that stuff. Let's see. Let me check my notes. Oh, one other thing on Space 1999. Let me pull up the slides. Okay, so remember I said something about the first thing I'd do is I'd redo the Eagle, and I talked about how the cockpit was all jacked up. Okay, so here's an example of the sort of thing that I think would work instead, right? So the one on the right has recessed windows, the one on the left does not. But that's sort of, I think, a better look for the Eagle. And I think if you put something like the one on the left, if you put a cockpit that sort of had windows like that on the front of it, aesthetically, it would maintain a lot of the same feel, but at the same time, it would make a lot more sense than what you saw, right? You'd have to redo the inside of the cockpit, but I think that the outside, something like that would work well. The other thing about it is that I would also change the landing pads, because I think the problem the problem that I have with the landing pads is that I don't think the thrusters there give you enough control authority. And so what I would do is something like this. This is the lander from Alien Covenant. And those engines on the side, those landing engines, swivel. They swivel out. And I think if I remember correctly, they also swivel forward and back. They swivel in and out more than they do forward and back, but they have a lot more control authority than those bell nozzles do on the underside of the Eagle. So what I would probably do is move the landing legs inside, and I'd have what's currently the landing legs on the Eagle, I'd have it be something like this to give you a lot more control authority. Now, landing on the moon is interesting, and SpaceX runs into this problem. SpaceX and everybody else runs into this problem, and that is when you get close to the ground, and this is the bigger your spacecraft, the bigger an issue this is. If you've got a lot of thrust and you're getting close to the ground, you start interacting with the ground, right? And you start throwing up gravel and shit like that. We saw that happen with the first SpaceX Starship launch, right, where they had the rapidly unscheduled digging the launch site, and then you had what was called the concrete tornado come about because you're throwing up junk. Well, that's going to happen if you land on the moon. And so there's some thought that the SpaceX Starship variant that they're going to do for the human landing system is actually not going to land using its vacuum Raptors at the bottom of that rocket. It's going to land using Super Dracos, which is the rocket that they created that's part of the abort system for the Dragon capsule. It's going to use Super Dracos up higher, and those are engines that have less thrust, but that's okay because you're only going to use it for the final landing on the moon, right? You use the vacuum Raptors to get you down so you're going really slow, and then you shut those off so that they're not throwing junk up into the back up in to interact with the spacecraft, and you use the Super Dracos to actually land on the moon. And so you're going to run into any problem where you have stuff like this. I kind of envision that this thing, as it comes down to the ground, it starts deflecting the thrust out more as it gets close to the ground. And so that's less efficient because you're not right underneath it, but it's keeping it in place as it gets closer to the ground, and it's not throwing all the junk back up straight into the spacecraft where you don't want it to be. So that's my thinking on that. Let's see. Okay, so next thing is I was gonna ask Alec about this, but he's not here, so I'm gonna go ahead and do it. And that is, I'm gonna talk about a few things that I gave to Alec a couple of years ago. Specifically, the date on this document is 11 December 2018. So let me tell you all the story about me getting together with Alec originally. So Alec and I were put into contact with each other through somebody who else that worked on Axanar. He volunteered and did some patches and stuff like that, and he hasn't been involved with for a while. But he made the introduction, and Alec and I had a little bit of interaction early on, but it wasn't really at a point in their production where I could help them. And so and Alec was getting ready. I think he was getting ready to do the move to Atlanta, and he just didn't have time to talk to some guy who he didn't yet understand who it was. And that's fine. It just wasn't a good time for either one of us. We then reconnected at SphinxCon, which was a one-off Honor Harrington Con in Atlanta that ran in like November of 2018. So about a month before I sent Alec the document that I sent him. And so I went down with Sphinx Con, and Alec and I and David Weber were on a panel together that was called How the Honorverse Influenced Axanar. And so there was also a separate track, a con within the con called Axicon. And Gary Graham was there, and J.G. Hertzler was there, and the guy who plays the Admiral was there, and I want to say there was one other person that was there. There was like 4 of the actors were there. I got a chance to have a half-hour-long conversation with J.G. Hertzler. It was really pretty cool. But in any event, we're on this panel together, and I'm introducing myself, former professor, U.S. Naval War College, professional naval analyst, war game designer, etc. And I watched the light bulb go off over Alec's head. I watched the light bulb go off as he goes, "Oh, okay, yeah, I should talk to this guy." And so he invites me to be part of the Axicon, and so I jump in on a bunch of Axicon panels, and we do a little interview. Like if you're a Patreon member supporting Axanar, you can get access to the interview that I did with him there. I did this 15-minute interview with him, and J.G. Hertzler's watching it from the table over there. And then afterwards was when J.G. and I had our conversation. John's a good guy. I like him a lot. And Alex says, "Well, did you get a chance to see the sets? Were you part of that?" And I said, "No, I wasn't part of that. I was busy doing programming." And he said, "Well, you should come down sometime." So I later went down and got a chance to see the sets, etc. But that was a couple of months in the future. But at some point where he sends me a copy of the script to comment on. And so this is the hour-and-a-half version of the script, right? And I think he's got some deal where you can, at some point, he's going to make that available. But this is not what they're actually filming. I haven't seen the filming script. And so it includes a reference into it to a fleet operations panel, a fleet operations console. Maybe he even says something about that at the con. But in any event, I say, "Well, do you know what the fleet operations console does on the Ares class?" And he says, "No, I don't." I said, "I do. Would you like me to tell you?" He said, "Yeah." And so I put together a document. Now, technically, it's covered under the NDA, which is why I would have asked him if he were here. I'm only going to talk about this as a general rule. I'm only going to talk about the stuff where I said, "Here's what I would suggest that you do with that." I'm not going to talk about what I read in the script. And to be honest, I really don't remember the script, other than I thought I liked it a lot. I thought it had a lot of good things going with it, but I don't know what the new script looked like, and I'm not going to talk about the old script. Other than it, rereading my comments made me think about some things. Sonia has a comment that it doesn't matter that crews are segregated by member world because we train together. And so that has some interesting implications for doctrine and training, etc., which got me thinking about, and this is a question I just simply don't remember. Has Starfleet ever fought a major conflict by this point? Now, Earth fought the Romulans. I don't know that Starfleet fought the Romulans. If it was Starfleet, I don't know if it was Starfleet or whether it was Earth that carried the burden of that war against them. Now, of course, Starfleet was originally an Earth organization, right? Starfleet sort of became the overarching organization, but Starfleet actually predates the Federation in the same way that the U.S. Navy predates the United States of America. So I don't have a good feel for that. And so that would actually explain a few things, especially if you're like an exploration corps that's got this, of course you're going to, One Horse Shea says supposedly it was Earth and Andor that did the heavy lifting, which, there's some interesting ways that you can do that. Like, for instance, if you think about World War II, we were allies with the Soviets. How many joint US-Soviet operations were there? I think it's 0, right? I don't think there were any. Could be wrong on that, but they would be weird, few and far between, right? The Russians did their thing, we did our thing. We did stuff with the Brits, but even there, as a general rule, you had like the British Army and the US Army coordinating with each other, but that didn't usually mean that you had British units and US units intermixed. Now, Navy-wise, that's a little different. In World War I, the US Navy sent units over to be part of the Grand Fleet. And so if you had to do that, you had to sort of coordinate and you learn how to do that. But that sort of stuff is hard. We do that with NATO all the time now, and it's hard for US Navy units that go and plug into Standing Naval Group Atlantic, if that group even still exists. But I talked with somebody, and like they showed up and they got beaten like a rented mule for the first couple of months because they didn't understand any of the procedures, despite the fact the US Navy wrote those procedures back in the day. As a general rule, we did the first draft of all that stuff. And then we didn't adopt it for our own internal procedures, and we sort of moved away from it. But these guys had spent months prepping for the fact that they were going to be detailed to this joint force, this coalition force in the Atlantic, and they still didn't understand the battle rhythm and stuff like that. Like they weren't getting their paperwork in on time. And from working, I did an exercise where I worked with the Dutch. And I've done some work with the Canadians and some work, did another exercise where we were working with the Japanese, etc. Everybody's got their own way of doing things. And it includes things like whether you mark something priority or not. And different people do things differently in that regard. So like the Dutch would mark everything as routine, and if you marked it immediate, it meant, oh my God, fire, fire, fire. Oh my God, disaster, emergency, emergency. Whereas we would mark everything immediate, we being the US Navy would mark everything immediate if it was operational, and if it was administrative, we'd marked it routine. And if the system that's sending all the messages around sees that and prioritizes accordingly. And so the Dutch orders going out to all the units were delayed going through the US system. And this was causing problems. But this is why you do joint exercises. So you learn stuff like that. So it makes me wonder if, going back to the war with the Romulans, if the Andorians are doing their own thing from a military standpoint, and Earth is doing its own thing from a military standpoint, and they're not actually getting together, well, now you get to the point where you're fighting in the war against the Klingons, and you're actually having different national ships, right? So you've got this ship is crewed by people from Earth, this ship is crewed by people from Andor, et cetera, but they're actually trying to do joint task forces together. If they don't have a common doctrine, that would be hard. And if Starfleet is primarily viewing itself as an exploration force that sort of does these other things if they need to, it seems to me that might be a place where their doctrine might be sort of shallow, shall we say. I mean, even the US Navy had internal issues, as I've talked about, whereas it used to be at the beginning of World War II, every different fleet did doctrine differently. It was only towards the middle to the end that they actually had a standardized doctrine. So One Horse Shea says, this is why Garth so important to Trek lore. Without him, there isn't a joint operating Starfleet. I'm going to get to that a little bit more. Okay, so Sonia's comment's very interesting. Scrolling down. So the Ares class are purpose-built warships. Ares herself, more importantly, is being modified into a command ship. This is what I'm reading you what I sent to Alec. This means more and better communications, which I propose include superior data link capability. So basically, it's not just about being a better warship, it's about more effectively using the capabilities already extant within the fleet. In this case, the data link capability allows the electronic passing of information between ships. Specifically, it allows the passing of the following: track data, orders and other communications, status reports, including fire allocation, etc., other sensor data. Now, I should add, it's also going to include signature information, right? And which gets you identification. So it's not just track, the tracking portion of the kill chain. It's also identification, et cetera, et cetera. So like once my ship knows that that ship is a D7 and its left engine seems to be having a warp coil that's malfunctioning, then everybody else knows it too. Why haven't we seen this in Star Trek before? Two reasons. First, because in most Star Trek shows, we were talking about one Federation hero ship versus a small number of enemies, sometimes only one. In other words, there's no one to data link with, right? The number of times in the original original series that we see multiple ships, we never see the Enterprise as being part of a multiple ship task force. So yeah, Commodore, what's his name? Commodore Wesley coming in. Maybe he's data linking all over the place, but we don't see it. Second, when there are things that look like Federation fleet actions, that capability is old enough to become automatic. It's a variation of the idea that no one would make a movie today where the MacGuffin is a telephone. Telephones are just part of the background now. So nobody talks about the data link in Star Trek because, of course, there's a data link. Of course, they're passing that information back and forth. Why would you talk about that? You might as well be talking about, like I said, telephone, right? Oh, wow, let's call them on the telephone. There were movies when telephones were new where the MacGuffin was the telephone. If you ever saw the old Sandra Bullock movie, The Net, remember the internet being the MacGuffin in that movie? That movie did not age well. Okay, so the Fleet Ops Console is the interface for the new capabilities that have been added to Ares to enable Garth to command his fleet. The Tactical Console is about fighting the ship. The Fleet Ops Console is about fighting the fleet. The Fleet Ops Console should do the following things. Allow the collection of information from a variety of sources. These include all of the sensors of the ships of the fleet, the status of all the ships, including what they are targeting, and any tactical assessments that the other captains are making. Allow the display of that information. Enable the evaluation of the information. Disseminate the information out to the rest of the fleet, and facilitate the control of the fleet. And every single one of those words I just emphasized, those 5 words, are the U.S. Navy's 5 functions of a combat information center. Talk more about CICs in just a moment. So basically, the Fleet Ops Console is sucking in all the information from all of the tactical consoles throughout the fleet, processing it into a coherent common operating picture, sharing it, and then promulgating Garth's orders back out to the fleet. That's my proposal. In a modern warship, the ship is not fought from the bridge. It's fought from the Combat Information Center. That's where the captain goes when there is a battle. That is where all of the sensor feeds go. That's where the weapons are fired from. That is the room with the big screens on the wall and lots of people clustered around consoles. Star Trek follows a long science fiction tradition, also present in the Honor Harrington series, of unifying command decision-making on the bridge of a spacecraft rather than bifurcating, maneuvering the bridge and combat, CIC. So if Star Trek ships have a CIC, what are they for? And I think if I remember correctly, there was something in the script mentioning CIC, which is why I'm talking about it here. So if Star Trek ships have CICs, what are they for? I would suggest that the Ares CIC is originally there to support the tactical console, but in this case, they added support for the fleet operations console as well. Basically, the staff of CIC collects, collates, evaluates, and disseminates the information to the fleet ops console, where it is available for the fleet commander's use. Since the viewer isn't going to see CIC, they won't understand that's what is happening, but I would argue that's what's happening behind the scenes. I'm assuming that some of the other ships in the fleet have had upgrades as well, either their own fleet ops consoles or added capabilities at existing workstations. For the ships that have received the consoles, this functions as their communications node with the rest of the fleet and gives them the ability to assume the command ship role if the need arises. When I've talked in the past about excuse me, composite warfare commander system, I talked about how there were backups for all the warfare commanders. And so, like, if Zulu is out of action, Zulu has a backup who takes over that role. And so this would help enable that. So back to the production question. What should those 3 displays on the Fleet Ops console be displaying? Because there were 3 displays that he talked about. I suggest they are status displays. Now, let me preface this by saying I have absolutely no idea what they're doing because this was input before the script was done, right? Because I'm giving input for what would have been the 90-minute script. And then the 90-minute script got thrown away and it got turned into two 20-minute scripts, right? And so I have absolutely no idea what's going on there. I don't know what the special effects look like. For all I know, they're not even going to show the fleet ops console. Everything that I've said might go out the window. Plus, you know, I'm not a video guy, right? I'm not a production guy, right? Alec is the guy who's making all that stuff happen. Alec and his directors are the guys that are making all that stuff happen. I have an entirely different concern here. And so it might very well be that Alec read it and said, yeah, that dog don't hunt. So, which is fine, right? I give him my input as a subject matter expert, but my subject matter is naval analysis and stuff like that. That's what I'm the expert in. His subject matter expertise in this case is making the damn movie. So back to the production question. What should those three displays of the fleet ops console be displaying? I would suggest they are status displays. One console should say data link status. It has two parts. On one side is a tabular list of the ships of the fleet, which part of the network they are connected to. Basically, each ship is connected to the element leader, each element leader is connected to the squadron leader, and each squadron leader is connected to Garth. As ships move and or links are destroyed, those links are reestablishing themselves based on local connectivity concerns. So this console is displaying which ships are part of the link and what the health of the link is. The other half of the display is a graphical representation of this network. My mental model for this is a computer network map. When a given network node is under attack, the color of the links change to highlight which ships will fall out of contact if the node is destroyed. Right. And so the network's going to heal, right? They're going to reconnect, et cetera, just like if you take out a server, everything goes to someplace else. But it may take a while to reestablish all that stuff. One console should say fleet status and the display status information and display status information for the ships of the fleet. It's basically a tabular list of the ships with some health status indicators next to the ship name. A good inspiration for this would be some of the information displays for video games, right? Show you the health of the various characters and stuff. Maybe 3 graphic indicators, thermometer bars, color-coded, etc., and a string of text, e.g. attacking Klingon D7, shields failing. So status report from the ship. The final center console would be the combat status, and it would be a geospatial display tracking the spatial location of all the contacts and their ID. It should be obvious whether the contact is friendly, hostile, or unknown, or natural, e.g. asteroids. It's probably going to be too cluttered for there to be individual ships. It should probably be by squadrons. I suggest Googling NTDS display for some ideas. Note in particular the lines extending from the icons. This is on the NTDS displays. Those are speed leaders and represent the vector, the line representing both the direction of movement and the speed of the contact. Sidebar, for years I have wondered why Federation ships use their main bridge display as a window. It's dark and there's nothing to see out there. A much better use of that display would be a schematic of the tactical situation with own ship in the center, or in this case, a battle display with some of these smaller displays replicated on it. On TV, we sometimes see schematic data on the screen, but that should really be the default mode of use. So that was about 2/3 of my input to Alec. Like I said, the first part of it was specific comments on the script, which I won't get into because the script is covered under the NDA. And because I have no idea what they're doing with the script. I don't know if it's relevant anymore or not. So One Horse Shay says, I've seen in the newest Star Trek RPG list, the Galaxy class became that in the Dominion War. I think he means a command ship. And you see Galaxy classes in the background in the various Dominion War shots. And I can't remember what the source is, but the claim is somewhere that those were Galaxy hulls that had not yet been finished. Because I think in the next gen tech manual, it talked about how they were going to partially build some hulls as long as the production line was hot. They were going to crank out a couple of extras and then wait to finish them. presumably to get some more data back from the experience of the Galaxy class. And they probably could have been improved because, as you may recall, Galaxy classes kept blowing up during next gen. I think we lost 2 or 3 of them. And so later on during the Dominion War, those Galaxy classes have a lot of supplemental equipment. Those are warships. Those are Galaxy hulls converted into warships. Those are not the equivalent of the Enterprise. They've got a lot of other stuff going in. One Horse Shay says, yeah, 65% were hollow and unofficially labeled War Galaxy. Yeah, so they just didn't put in the stuff they didn't need. In some other places, they put in some extra stuff, extra generators, et cetera, and then left the rest of it alone. Because why bother carrying all that extra mass around? Why bother going to the trouble of putting it in and not just, if you're not going to use it, why put it in? You can always put it in. If the ship survives, you can put it in later. So, okay. So that's most of what I was going to talk about tonight, but not everything. I was going to want to talk a little bit about a few things about Starfleet ships. And these are things that I've said before over the course of the last 2.5, 3 years, however long we've been doing this. But I don't think I've said them lately. And that's Starfleet ships. One interesting thing about Starfleet ships is the crew size. Now, if I remember correctly, the crew size on the Galaxy class was something like 1,000. Which seems big, but really isn't, considering how big that ship is. I mean, the length of the primary hull, if I remember correctly, is about the length, maybe it's the width of the primary hull. It's about the length of the Enterprise from the original show. The original Enterprise carried 430 people. The Galaxy class, if the Galaxy class carried 10 times as many people, it would still be underpopulated. But I think if I remember correctly, the you know what? This is why Google exists. Galaxy class complement. Let's see if Google can give me a fast answer to that. Yeah, Galaxy class typically had a complement of just over 1,000. Now it said Memory Alpha says 1,000 to 6,000, with 15,000 being the maximum capacity. But I would expect, that could be much bigger. 430, if you think about the level of automation that the Federation should have been capable of, why did you have 430 on the Enterprise? Well, when the U.S. Navy crews a ship, like the U.S. Navy crewed the Oliver Hazard Perry class frigates, and it had 200 and some people on those ships, or 198 or something like that. It was around that number. And when they gave them to the Australians, or when we sold them to the Australians cut the crew in half. How could they do that? Well, the answer is that U.S. Navy requirements and Australian Navy requirements were not the same. U.S. Navy requirements are that every shift be able to get underway. So if you've only got a third of the people on the ship, which you'd normally have a third or a fourth of the people on the ship at any given time, depending upon whether you run a 3-section watch or a 4-section watch, that any watch section should be able to get the ship underway. And that is not how they did it in the Australian Navy. The assumption is that if you needed to get underway, you'd call back a minimum number of crew in order to be able to get underway. So that explains import stuff. But if you're just dividing by 3 and you've got a third of the crew on board, and then you might only have a third of the crew on board in port, but it's not enough to get underway. Whereas in the U.S. Navy, it would be. If there was an emergency, something was going on in the port, right? Major fire in the port, heading towards the fuel dumps. We're too close. Let's get out of the way, right? Ammunition ship on fire. Let's get underway, right? They can do it. We also visit every space on the ship during a watch section. It's my understanding they do a complete survey of the ship. And so we also will try to man all the warfare sections so that, when you call general quarters, you bring everybody on board. Everybody gets out of the rack, even if they're sleeping, right? They have to go work. But as a general rule, you try to be able to have, fight the war 24 hours a day with the people you have on duty. If you've got time to go to general quarters, that's great. But the idea is that you should be capable of conducting combat ops before everybody else gets there out of their rack. Australians didn't do it that way either. And so they're able to cut back on the crew. So I think that that's part of the reason why, for instance, the crew of the Enterprise was so large, the original show, that it was 430, is that they had a lot of redundancy and they need to be able to do that. Second reason, I think, is that they had to be able to compensate for crew attrition because they were alone and unafraid. And, they might be in a situation where they would take significant damage through, a disaster or combat, and they've got to be able to have enough people to run the ship afterwards. And so if you lose a third of the crew and you've got 430 people, you're in much better shape than if you've got 100 people and you lose a third of the crew. So I think part of it was just having that level of redundancy because they were alone and unafraid. I think the third reason why they do it that way is because they needed to have a minimum size community. Because, okay, so what does a 5-year mission mean? I think that just means the assignments are 5 years, and it's like 5 years before she has a major yard period, right? So she's going to deploy for 5 years. That doesn't necessarily mean that anybody's going to be on board for 5 years, but it probably means that some of the people are going to be on board for 5 years. And maybe it means exactly that you go off on a 5-year mission. You've signed to go off for 5 years. That seems like a lot to us, but remember, when you join the army in Roman times, the minimum commitment was 20 years in a society where a lot of people were dead by 50. So I think part of that was you're going to see the same group of people. You need to be big enough to be a community. And so the ship was big enough. They had a big enough crew that they could form. They wanted to be, at the very least, a small town. My mom grew up in a town of about 400 people, 430-ish, 500, something like that. Smaller than that now, but that's what the size of the town was at the time. And so I think that was kind of the feel that they were aiming for there. Okay, so that was the first thing, crew size. The second thing I was going to talk about a little bit is solo performers versus fleets. And I've sort of touched on some of this here. Like, I don't think that most of Starfleet spends its time operating with other ships. I think that most of the time when you see ships together, that they're sort of doing their own thing. And it might be that they have a rendezvous in deep space. And it might be even that they go and they do a mission together, but it's like, okay, you go over here while I'm going over here. Because most of those missions aren't the sort of things that the military does. They're exploration missions. And so you don't have things like, combat wingmen sorts of things, right? The unit of deployment is not a squadron, right? When battleships deploy, they deploy by squadrons. There's a squadron commander of, and they will deploy as a squadron. So you've got a squadron of 4 battleships, and they sort of operate together, et cetera, and they work with each other all the time. And the idea that they're going to just sort of go off and do their own thing. I mean, yeah, you go out to sea just to prove that you can go to sea, and you might go do gunnery trials by yourself, but you don't fight by yourself. Whereas I think Starfleet ships spend an awful lot of time by themselves until the balloon goes up, at which point they have to get together. So the question is, when it's before the balloon has gone up, when was the last time do you think they actually got together and did something unified, right? I think that they've got a lot of ability to practice because they've got really good simulators. I think they've got a lot of written doctrine that by the time of next gen has, 150 years of thinking behind it. But I also think that they probably have to relearn how to do some stuff each and every time they do it, because Starfleet officers are busy. They don't have time to spend all their time rereading doctrine. So I think it takes some time to get back up to speed. But I also think that there are specialists in the fleet who are the people that know how to do this stuff because that's their branch, right? They don't get a separate colored uniform, but that's their specialty. I think Jean-Luc Picard's specialty was exploring, and Jellicoe's specialty was war. And so that's why he's the natural one to slot in to that situation, because it looks like the balloon's going to go up and we need a no-nonsense war leader. And that's pretty much what he is. And that would help solve the solo performer problem. The fact that they don't normally cooperate with each other in that sort of way. It also helps that I think a lot of this stuff is done automatically, like the data networks, et cetera, I think sort of set themselves up automatically. We spend an awful lot of time managing that stuff because a lot of that stuff is configured by human beings. I said that I did an exercise with the Dutch. I was on board a U.S. cruiser, the USS Philippine Sea. There was a Dutch command staff on board with a Dutch admiral and his people, and a Belgian chief of staff, because it was the Belgian-Netherlands task group, but there was one Belgian involved. There were Dutch ships that were part of the formation and U.S. Navy ships that were part of the formation. And every day the communications officer got up and said, and he showed us the stoplight chart that showed which circuits were working with which ships could talk to each other. And when he first put it up, it was a sea of red. 11 days later, it was all green. And I said, don't you find it really disheartening that it took 11 days? Because he had previously, the comms officer had told me, yeah, we spent, we were telling you guys for months what the issues were going to be, because we went and worked with you guys in the Gulf. We've had to plug into your networks before. We know how to do this. We know what the settings on the routers have to be, but somebody has to go and make those changes on the routers. And so I said, aren't you really, doesn't it discourage you that it still took 11 days, even though you knew what all the problems were? And he said, no, this is great. It took us 52 days in the Gulf. We did it in 11 days here. Okay, I think that even though Starfleet may not practice this stuff, Starfleet does have the advantage that all their comm stuff just kind of works, right? So you never have a situation where they're having to reprogram the data nodes, or the connectivity. You never have like situations where the radios just don't work. Anytime something is not working, there is a reason why that it's not working that is external to the ship. You don't have stuff just break in Star Trek. Ion storms are bad. Ion storms affect a lot of things, but you don't have just like, I don't know, sir, it's misconfigured. I've got Smitty down playing with the switches in the router. We're hoping to get it back. You don't have stuff like that. And so I think that helps, the fact that they can plug into each other. There's still a little bit of getting, they still have to learn how to work together and stuff like that, but at least the gear always works. Okay, so let me take a last quick look here, because we're at about the hour mark, and I'm willing to go ahead and call it. Olive Drab says, I actually tend to assume some of the nearer home systems fleets may operate pretty near each other, really covering each other's stations, running around to respond to things, etc. Yeah, I think so, although it's unclear to me that how many fleet stuff is there, right? I don't recall ever seeing anything in Star Trek that looked like a pre-established squadron. We see combat taking place during the Dominion War, but I kind of get the impression that it was like, okay, you, and you go join this fleet, sort of stuff, as opposed to there is a fleet organization that actually works together. And so, yeah, there's probably some stuff where they're, I don't want to make it sound like, oh my God, I've never seen another Starfleet ship before. I don't think that's it at all. But I don't think that there isn't a long history of, yeah, we're in the same squadron and we go off on maneuvers together all the time, right? Like if you were in the US Navy in the interwar period, you were assigned to a ship that was in a squadron, and those are the other ships in the squadron. They're with you all the time. You berth next to each other when you go into port, right? Your crews know each other, et cetera, because you're all in the same squadron. You know the guys in the squadron in the next peer over too. I don't want to make it sound like you never see anybody outside of your squadron, but your squadron has a common chain of command. You know, the chain. You know, your captain is reporting to the same commodore that the captains next to you are reporting to, or the same admiral, right? And so when you go out to do stuff, you generally go out, yeah, as a unit. And so it's not clear to me that Starfleet has that. After Best of Both Worlds and Dominion War, there is one at Earth now seen at the end of Voyager. Yeah, that I think that that's the case. I'd have to go back and rewatch it. It might just be that that's, they flushed the ships that were there locally. But it would make sense that they would work together. It would make sense that you'd have a fleet at Earth, because apparently Earth is the only planet in the Federation that any of the bad guys ever care about. Olive Drab said, on the other hand, lots of the captains seem to know each other. Yeah, and that's a really good. There's a very interesting question implied there. Do all of them seem to know each other because Starfleet is that small? Or do all of them seem to know each other because we only see a portion of Starfleet and all of those guys know each other, right? If you think about it, with the exception of Voyager thrown to the other side of the universe, everybody else we've seen is operating near the Klingons, near the Romulans, sort of that part, right? So if you think about it, we can go off on a tangent about maps. I've already talked about maps. I mean, I think the real problem here is that you're dealing with two-dimensional maps when it should be three-dimensional, and there should be sort of things all around, right? But okay, two-dimensional maps, you've sort of got this area where the Klingons, the Federation, and the Romulans all sort of come together, and that's where almost everything is. And the Cardassians are close enough; they're in there somewhere. It's really kind of unclear because no two sets of star maps agree with each other. They're all close enough to each other, but like, what about the guys that are on the other side of the Federation? I wonder if it's not like East Coast and West Coast, or home port stuff. Now, that having been said, if you go back to World War II, all of the admirals that fought in the Pacific were graduates of the Naval Academy. They were also all graduates, almost all of them, with the exception of like two, were graduates of the Naval War College. These are people that had known each other their entire careers. I mean, Willis Lee and Mark Mitchner were friends in college. And so, 20 years later, 25 years later, they're working together, and they've known each other that entire time. They were friends at the academy, and they've known each other that entire time. Same with the Civil War, the U.S. Civil War. All the Civil War generals knew each other on both sides because West Point just wasn't that big. So if they're all going to Starfleet Academy, it makes you wonder how many of these people know each other. Especially the ones that, it might be like, I haven't seen Bob in 20 years because he's basically running a buoy tender on the other side of Federation space. But I see, Bob's roommate, we've been both on this side of the Federation. We've been working together for the last 30 years. Right. So it wouldn't surprise me if there wasn't something like that going on with Starfleet. Okay, so yeah, One Horse Shay said something that I was going to say, probably like East Coast, West Coast. right? Probably like East Coast, West Coast, probably like port stuff. Like I've run into people from like one of my bosses at my last job had been in the same squadron when he was in the Navy as one of my colleagues at a previous job. They knew each other from 20 years. They knew each other from the 1970s, early 1980s, that time period, because they had both been in the same squadron in Charleston, South Carolina, back in the day, and constantly running into people like that. It's like, guys of a certain age. It's like, you're a SWO? Do you know such and such? Oh yeah, we know each other. In fact, I always make a point when I run into people of asking them, do you know such and such, right? And so one of the things I've discovered is the P3 community is big and dispersed. There's one instance where I mentioned somebody in the P3 community and somebody else said, oh yeah, I've heard of that guy. But that's it. Whereas with the SWOs, it's like, if there's East Coast guys and there's West Coast guys, and especially if you were stationed in Japan, the people that were stationed overseas had a tendency to try to camp, and the Navy generally let them. So like if you went to Japan, you probably bounced around in Japan for 10 years because it was a pain in the ass to move you back stateside. And so if you were happy in Japan, they left you in Japan, and they might move you from ship's company to squadron staff back to another ship, probably not the one you went back to, started with. Now, back in the interwar period in the U.S. Navy, they had a tendency to send you back to the ship you were on previously. So you might go off to the War College, but then go back. It wasn't unusual for an ensign on board a battleship to end up as the CO of that battleship 25 years later, 20 years later, something like that. And just, you go and do something ashore. And then when you went back to the fleet, you went back to that ship. Part of that is small number of ships. But part of that was, I think there was a conscious decision to try to plug people back into familiar environments. So, yeah, One Horse Shay says they act like all officers go to the academy, so you'd think they know each other. It's unclear to me. I don't know that we've ever gotten an official estimate as to how big the academy is. And it would be really, really interesting, because here's the sort of analysis that you can do. You figure out how many people graduate from the academy. You figure out how many people are in the different classes of warships. And make some assumptions about how many people leave and how long people stay in Starfleet. And you should be able to figure out the maximum size of Starfleet from that. You also need to make some assumptions about how many admirals you have, how many people you have ashore, right? Somebody's got to be manning space dock, right? You can't tell me that space dock is like one admiral and 10,000 enlisted guys, right? Or 10,000 civilians. There's got to be officers manning all these bases and stuff like that. So if everybody is an academy grad, then that is a limit on how many ships you can have in the fleet. I am skeptical that everybody is the academy grad, for the reason that Olive says, how many academies? That's a really good question. I suspect that the academy we see in San Francisco is the Earth Academy. There's probably one in Andor, and there's probably one in I don't know if there's a Vulcan one, because the Vulcans are weird about that. But there might very well be, I'm trying to remember, Tellarite. The Tellarites might also have one too. And so maybe that's how that works. Now, you wouldn't necessarily, you could go to any of the academies, but you might go to the one that's closest. It's, like, one of the interesting things about the U.S. military academies is, they're service academies, but you don't have to take a commission in that service. You can go to the Air Force Academy and get commissioned in the Navy if you wanted to. It's not recommended, because that is potentially problematic. But there have been instances where people have gone to one of the academies and have said, you know, this academy experience has taught me that I want to be in the military, but B, not this one. And so I want to be in some other service. And I know of people that have switched service. I know I remember one guy who um, left the army and switched over to the Air Force. And he was in an army assignment for a while. It took a while to sort of make all that stuff work. So, I mean, he literally went home in an army uniform on Friday and came back in an Air Force uniform on Monday and had to work there for another couple of months before it's time for him to go off and do his first Air Force assignment. And there was professionally, there were some hurt feelings about that. Olive says Vulcan has to have one. They have all Vulcan ships. Yeah, but I think that's the Vulcan Science Academy. They have to have something, but it's not clear to me that it's a Starfleet level academy. It's not clear to me that that's what that is. That it might be something that's really, because the Vulcans sort of maintain their own force. And that actually sort of, we don't have a good feel for places like Andor. Does Andor have its own military in addition to Starfleet? We kind of get the impression that Earth doesn't, that Earth has gone all in on Starfleet. But I wonder about Andor because Vulcan clearly hasn't gone all in on Starfleet. Vulcan is kind of interesting. One Horse Shay says, I assume there's the equivalent of ROTC. Could very well be. Never heard it mentioned. I don't recall there being any talk of any other commissioning source other than the Academy. So, well, let's see. Let me take a look at my list real quick and make sure that I haven't forgotten something. Solo performance, Starfleet World War. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up here. I am pretty much available for the rest of the year, with the probable exception, actually, of the Saturday before New Year's. I think the Saturday before Christmas. Yeah, Christmas is a Monday. I'm probably going to do my driving on Sunday. So the Saturday before Christmas is a probable but not guaranteed, but I plan to be here the rest of the time up until then. Probably the Saturday before Christmas, probably not, because I think I'm going to be here and it doesn't matter when I drive the next day. Probably not the Saturday before New Year's. January is a little dicey. There's a science fiction convention in there. So the second Saturday in January is probably not going to work. And then I'm still sort of sorting out the rest of my schedule. Of course, all of that could change because it is wintertime in the Midwest. And so if I'm going east, I have to drive through mountains. If I'm going west, I'm in the Great Plains. And so I made the comment to my dad. It's like, I'm going to figure out this elaborate schedule and none of it's going to matter because when push comes to shove, the weather is going to determine what I do. So basically, if it's going to be 10 degrees, 10 below out, I'm not driving. I'm tired of pumping gas with a wind chill of 10 below. I'm just tired of doing that. So, so with that in mind, I think I'm going to go ahead and call it, everybody. And so, thank you very much, everybody. And I'll see you next week. Have a good evening.